Hey guys, as you may have seen, I was invited to playtest the new cards for Battlegrounds Season 3. We are going to have a new type added, namely the Undead. Now, that always brings a big meta shift with it, so I figured I'd make a video and explain to you guys what I have learned in that playtesting event so you can have a successful day one of the new cards and hopefully get ahead of the curve with your MMR. Now, the first thing I want to really stress is that the game is going to feel different, and that is very intentional by Blizzard. So there's a few reasons. The two biggest ones is, number one, seeing as Undead are the new type, it is going to be in every single game. So if you just started playing in, let's say, the last half year, you've not been through this transition before where they've added a new type. This is very normal. Blizzard wants you to play with the new cards, so they will not be banned for, let's say, the first 2 weeks, but I'm not sure if it might even be a little longer. So that is going to make the games feel very, very centered around the new type, assuming that it's strong. And that's the second point, because it wouldn't be a lot of fun if the new type would be weak, and the best play would be to avoid it. Blizzard generally wants to err a bit on the side of caution there and make sure that things are stronger rather than weaker. And we've seen this before. When Kibler were introduced, when Naga were introduced, these were very, very lopsided metas, very, very dominated by the new type. But that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. Once again, if you just embrace that and you understand that it will get patched and just enjoy the craziness while it lasts. Okay, so as you've heard me mention, Undead are probably going to be very, very strong. When I played in the playtesting event together with all the other streamers, one thing became very clear very quickly. I believe it was my second game where I was in the finals versus Krip, and I had some amount of stats on my board, and I realized, oh wow, this is really not how to play it. So the first thing to point out is that Undead can get very high damage on pretty much everything. So the main culprit for this mechanic is a Nubarak. Nubarak is a 5-drop. I'll have it up on the screen as well so you can read it. But essentially, every time it dies, it buffs the attack of your Undead wherever they are. So that means Undead that you are going to buy later on are going to have this. Cards that are on the board are going to get that. Cards that are on the board when the Nubarak dies are going to get that during the combat. But also a token. So let's say we have something as silly as your own Nubarak reborning. That reborn version of the Nubarak will have however much attack you've already added. Now, when I first saw this card, I figured, well, this is a little bit slow. It's a 5/3. How good can it really be? It turns out with a little bit of setup, you can add, say, 16 attack to all your Undeads every single turn. Now, that is a fairly specific setup, so you're not always going to get that, but essentially that's 2 Anubaraks with Reborn on them. There is another card which is going to be very, very central to Undeads. It's the Soul Splitter. This card gives another friendly Undead Reborn. So essentially in the mid game, if you just say have 2 Anubaraks and 2 Soul Splitters, they will always target each other. The Soul Splitters will always target the Anubaraks because the Soul Splitters themselves also have Reborn. So super, super strong. So you can already start to think the synergy here. And you might say, wait, that's only 8. Where's the remaining 8? Well, that is a Baron Rivendare, which has now been replaced by Titus, seeing as Baron would be an Undead, and that would be weird because then later on Baron would not be in if Undeads were out, and also if Baron had a type that would heavily favor Undead because you could use all kinds of scaling mechanics that other types would not have access to. Okay, so that is the ideal setup, but even let's say if we do only half of that, you add 8 attack to every single one of your Undeads, no matter where they are at any point. Yeah, you can start to think if you have to tank that with just stats. So let's say a Nomi board or a Caligos board or a Theodar board. How much health would you need to tank these tokens? And it's a stupid amount because this very quickly goes up to 50, 60 damage per token. So anything that reborns, boom, comes back with like 50, 60 damage. That means that you have a card, for instance, the Colossus of the Sun. This is a 6/6 Divine Shield Reborn. Let's say a fairly conservative estimate, only 50 damage on this. So that means that you've only added 44 damage across the whole game, which in the late game is very, very possible. That is like 50 damage on the first hit, 50 damage after the shield is gone, 50 damage when it comes back with the shield, 50 damage after it lost the shield. That is one unit that is dealing 200 damage. And that's not even the best unit to buff, because you might say, well, that's clearly an outlier. This is crazy, right? Like you have a Divine Shield Reborn. You can have a card like Eternal Summoner. So Eternal Summoner summons 2 Eternal Knights. Now we'll talk about this card separately as well, because there are a few strategies, but Undead are very strong. But the first thing I want to mention, right, is that they have so much token power to just really help you make that mindset switch of, oh, stats are just a lot worse right now. So an Eternal Summoner summons 2 Eternal Knights, but you can reborn that Eternal Summoner. So then we are talking 3 procs on the main body and then another 3 procs on the second half. So instead of the 4 uses that we get out of the Colossus of the Sun, now you have Summoner, which is the Summoner body itself. 1 knight that it summons, 2 knights that it summons, reborn, right? Its own body again, then another knight that it summons. Then, yeah. So to tank that, we are talking ridiculous stats. So you have to be APM Pirates, and you have to have a pretty good game here. And that's not to mention the Undead player can just continue buffing the damage. In the playtesting event, at some point, I stopped buffing my attack because it was too much anyway. Okay, so that was the first thing I really wanted to hit home, is that it's very easy for Undead to build a lot of attack on pretty much every unit. Now, let's call that the first stage. That is sort of your budget Undead setup. I'm going to build a lot of attack on my units, and then I'll have a lot of reborns and shields and take advantage of that. What's step number 2 if you want to improve that? It's Sister Death Whisper. This is the high-end reborn engine. Every time a friendly minion is reborn, give your Undead +1/+3. The +1 not super relevant, but the +3 health, of course, very, very relevant, but because we just talked about how easy it is to juice up the attack. Well, here is the thing that patches your weakness, because what happens up until the point that you hit your Death Whisper, if your opponent has a bunch of Rat Pack tokens, if they use Blaster against you, if they have a bunch of Cleaves, you could run out of things where they just favorably trade over and over. Once you have a Death Whisper on the board and you start slamming a bunch of health on your units, this becomes much, much, much harder. I've seen the argument already in certain Twitch chats that it's, oh, I'm just going to run Blaster and kill this Undead token stuff, and it's not going to be that good, whatever. Yeah, you have 1 turn of Sister Death Whisper on your board, 3 health every time something reborns. So that's not 3 health per turn. That is anything that is still alive while another unit is reborning, that's +3 health. So let's say you have 3 units that die before your Colossus of the Sun dies, you're now already up 9 health from 1 round. So start thinking about how effective a Blaster can really be when the moment your opponent hits Death Whisper. And sure, there are going to be a lot of Undead players that die before they hit it, but if you want to start winning lobbies, I'm assuming that the top 2, maybe even top 3, is going to be alive long enough to get this card. And 1 is enough to patch up that weakness. Now, I've also played with it myself. I've had a golden version. I've had more than a golden version. So that's when you just start casually printing over 100 health on your Undead as well, or at least the things in the back. So usually the Death Whisper, which is pretty crazy. Now, keep in mind the Death Whisper is an Undead. She is also an eligible target for Soul Splitter. So you can still go into the end game with, say, 7 or 6 reborns on your board. All of them have a lot of damage. Most of them have a lot of health. Yeah, that's pretty good. So that's stage 2. We get a Sister Death Whisper, and we work on that weakness of having low health. Now, I'd say the final form of Undead's bullshit, if we want to call it that way, is it's Eternal Knights. An Eternal Knight on the board, when it dies, it gives +1/+1 to all other Eternal Knights, no matter where they are. So that means if one of my Eternal Knights dies on turn 3, turn 14, that knight will still have that +1/+1. So early game, this is still somewhat under control, still good, because you're buying, let's say you're on tier 2, you're buying an Eternal Knight. Sure, the first turn it's a 4/1, that's not so good, but then it's died, say, 3 times, and especially if you have 2 on the board, suddenly you start having 5 health, 6 health, you start trading, and you're like, oh, this is pretty good, right? But that's not like the absolute batshit crazy, because that's never going to be massively out of control. It's once Eternal Summoners start entering the playfield, especially an Eternal Summoner combined with a Soul Splitter putting Reborn on it. Now we are summoning 2 extra Eternal Knights, and if it reborns, another 2. So 1 Summoner with 1 Soul Splitter, which once again, keep in mind, that's not that hard to do. 1 triple into an Eternal Knight, Soul Splitter's a 4-drop, you pick that up pretty much regardless, so whenever you see it, and then suddenly you are making 4 Knights that are dying per turn, so drastically ramping up that scaling. And you can have more than 1 Eternal Summoner. I've had a Golden Summoner and a regular Summoner, and yeah, you can start to do the math of, oh wow, they get pretty big pretty fast. Now, the silly thing is that you don't have to do this strategy in isolation. This is a perfect addition to already buffing your board with an Uberak and buffing your board with Sister. Let's also scale some Eternal Knights. So the Eternal Knights get all the damage boost from the Uberak. So early on, they're going to be relevant. That's the important thing. So normally when you think about this slower type scaling, these Eternal Knights are not dealing that much damage, and it might be too slow, and you die before they get huge. But if the very first turn you play your Summoner, these Knights are already dealing 30 damage, that's a great unit. So you don't have that time, that warm-up time where you're like, okay, this is a bad card. No, it's instantly a strong card. And then as it just continues scaling, now your token gets a lot of health, so it can maybe even start value trading some stuff, which might be annoying because you actually want them to die. But that's such a luxury problem to have at that point where, oh no, my tokens are value trading your big things. When you then buy them from the shop and say they're like up to 40-40, you can triple that, and then the stats combine, and then you just get these true chunkers on your board. So yes, once again, don't be too afraid. Don't be too like, oh, the meta is going to be so bad. It's just going to be some craziness. I would say embrace it, have fun with it. Now, what are the things that you can do against this? Because this is also important to realize, is that it's not because something is the strongest that you can't do anything to slow them down. So this might be a little bit of a depressing prospect, but this was the same with Nagas. When you are playing in a meta where there is one very strong thing, yes, everybody is going to chase after that, but not everyone is going to get it. And people that get it, not all of them are going to get the premium setup. So what we are after, or at least what I'll be after, and anyone that wants to learn from me is usually after, is, okay, so how do I game this in terms of MMR? How do I make points from this bad situation? So the first is, of course, if you're being handed the pieces to do this, right? Get the Uberak, get the Titus to amplify the Death Rattle buff, make sure you buy early Soul Splitters, try to get a Sister Death Whisper, try to get an Eternal Summoner, but that's not going to be every game. Not every game you're going to be handed the pieces to do this. So you've already heard me mention earlier, up until the point the Undead players have Sister Death Whisper, they are somewhat vulnerable. So cleaves, tokens, mainly tokens. I would say there was one game in the playtest where I hung on for a long time. I ended up taking a solo 5 because an Undead board hit me for 30 damage at 1, and I believe I was at 29. So I took 30 damage because they had like Sister Death Whispers in the back and nothing died. But that illustrates my point, is up till then, I still had 29 health in the lobby playing just Rat Packs and Bird Buddies. So you have a much better chance at surviving if you are also playing a token-based strategy. And it's for the simple reason that if your opponent is summoning, say, they're early on in their setup, but they're summoning like 20 damage tokens, but they have like 2 health, 3 health, 4 health. You don't want to have like a dynamic duo against that and be like, all right, well, my duo trades with half of your reborn unit. Oh, that's not good, right? You're not winning that game. That's a bad game. And not only are you not winning that, you're barely killing anything. So when you lose, you take a lot of damage because you haven't killed a lot of units. Now, when you are playing a token-based strategy, either you run them out of stuff because your token strat is stronger, you got like the double Rat Pack, you got the reborn high main, and you just keep summoning stuff, maybe a Bird Buddy or 2 in the back to make sure the tokens deal enough damage to deal with some buffed up tokens. And then suddenly you're either taking rounds off undead players, or you're minimizing the damage taken because you might lose by one Eternal Knight that's alive at the end of the round, and that's a 2-drop, so then, you know, maybe take a 6 damage, 7 damage. Another unit that can help out is Juggler. This is very similar to, say, a Bird Buddy in the back. Now we have a Juggler in the back, and we have a bunch of Demon tokens instead of Beast tokens. My Demon tokens are hopefully trading 1-for-1 with their tokens, but then because of the juggle shots, eventually I come out on top. That is, once again, until they get to that point where Sister Death Whisper is scaling for them, or they have Eternal Summoner scaling going on, where at some point the Eternal Knights are just too large. Now, the usual instinct that you're going to have when you're going up against stronger players and you can't quite go toe-to-toe is to do Poison. But Poison is, quite frankly, completely pointless in that meta. Like, when you fight someone who has Mama Bears and Rat Packs, your first instinct isn't also like, oh, let me just quickly get some Toxfins. That does not work. So yes, play your own tokens, be it either Beasts or Demons or Omega Buster. I think that's another thing that could work quite well if you happen to get access to the Blaster, the Baron, the Buster, and Kangor. You can play a Mech ixxdeee comp, which once again I think will be quite effective until they get their sister scaling up, where, you know, almost nothing is going to die to your Blaster, which means that you're still going up against some quite large undead boards. But hey, if you have a Golden Baron and you have your Busters and you have Kangors, your tokens are quite large as well. So I do think that a proper ixxdeee Buster comp can win lobbies, can get rid of the undead boards. We're just assuming that they aren't big enough yet. But I think if you are going up against someone who's had everything checked, all the boxes checked, so they have the high attack check, so they make sure they one-shot all your tokens. They have a lot of health on their units with Sister Death Whisper, so there's going to be some value trading and nothing's going to die to your Blaster, check. And then also big Eternal Knights to make sure that they stay around. Yeah, I don't think you're going to beat that even with a good ixxdeee board, but let's, you know, maybe I'm wrong. Be good to see that there is a stronger comp. But anyways, you get the gist of it. Run your own tokens, mess with their tokens. Now, there is a tech card that was introduced. It's the Sindore Straight Shot, I believe. Yes. Now, this is going to attack, and when it attacks, its target will remove taunt, but the first attack will still connect with the originally taunted minion. That makes sense. It's not going to switch targets mid-attack. But that means that the second attack can go somewhere else. And the secondary effect is that it will also remove Reborn. So as we just talked about, the Undead strategy is to make very large tokens and then or very large attack units and then reborn them. Now, so if you can remove the Reborn off that, it's almost like a Poison War where you can think, okay, they now have 2 less units that I need to trade with. So in my experience in the playtesting event, in the end game, almost always ran a straight shot. Now, everyone was obviously spamming Undead because it's the preview event, and what are you going to do? Not play Undead? So keep in mind who you're playing against, but if you are, say, in that top 4 and it's just Undead, just don't sell your straight shots, because especially day 1, I think a lot of people are going to run into this where nobody's going to really have it down yet, and you're not going to want to go in with no taunts, because you don't want your Sister Death Whisper dying early. If you're running a new Barak with Titus, you don't want your Titus getting sniped early, so then you're going to want to taunt something. Pretty much everything's going to have Reborn anyway, so yeah, the straight shot, the perfect case scenario is your opponent has 2 taunt Reborns and you have a straight shot. That means you attack one, and then you can't miss, you'll attack the other, because it'll be the only thing left with taunt. So not only does that remove all the taunt and open up the snipe on the Sister Death Whisper, on the Titus, etc., it also means that those units will not be getting Reborn. So they are way worse after losing the Reborn. So end games, I think is going to be very strong to have a straight shot, almost like Leroy Queen, where you're in the end game and you know that you probably shouldn't sell that Leroy, but you kind of want to keep scaling. It's like, let me just sell the Leroy. It's like, just sell something else then, right? And you don't really want to scale against Undead anyway, because you don't outscale them. So you just don't sell your straight shot in the end game if you are up against a bunch of Undeads. I was tempted to sell it at one point, but I was very glad I didn't, and it definitely won me the game. The fact that I had it and my opponents didn't in that particular game. So super useful. Now there is another new card. I'm not going to cover all the cards. Collins and I, we have a podcast. I'll put the link to that in the description for those who don't know it yet, where we covered the meta quite at length and we talked about cards. But Fell Stomper is another card that really helps the token-based strategy. It's quite ridiculous, and I would say if Undead weren't as ridiculous, you'd look at this card and say, holy crap, how is this even remotely legal? Every time you summon a minion, your whole board gets 3 attack. So that is more than a ground shaker proc per summon. So yeah, you summon a bunch of rats, you know, things get a bunch of attack. You summon Eternal Knights yourself, you reborn something, that counts as a summon. So there's just a lot of ways to summon stuff. Essentially, the translation is run a bunch of tokens yourself. So yeah, I know it's going to be as strong as Reborn because the Fell Stomper strategy doesn't really do anything to give a lot of health to your tokens, whereas the other strategy with Sister Death Whisper and with the Eternal Knights, especially the Knights will have a lot of HP, so you end up value trading eventually. But very, very potent strategy to run early on, to just bunch of tokens and then Fell Stomper in the back to make sure that they deal enough damage. So that's essentially the, you know, if there was nothing else I could really tell you guys to take into day one, is that don't worry too much about stats. You're still going to want to work on your early game, of course, because the first few turns people don't have massive tokens yet, but you really want to start thinking once people start getting into tier 5 and tier 6, you have to start thinking like, okay, do I really want to spend my money on like Bran and a Jug here? Or do I just want to refine my board and build some good token stuff? Now, you can have some stats that go alongside the tokens, like for instance, Hungering Abomination is Avenge 1, gain +1/+1 permanently. That's fine to add to your board early on if you just have a bunch of tokens anyway. That just means that if you fight someone else with a bunch of tokens, that could be sort of your tiebreaker at the end to clean up with a lot of health. But don't go out of your way to just make this board with more traditionally high stats, because I don't think that is going to work very well. And lastly, we're going to have a quick talk about Putricide, which is the new hero. I was able to play him one time during the playtesting event, and I came in second there, but that was my second game, and I wasn't exactly sure what I had to do yet, because this hero has the potential to be just absolutely broken. Now, for a better explanation, once again, you can check out our latest podcast episode. I'll have the link in the description. But the essential strategy with Putricide is to try and get to tier 6 and use your hero power on tier 6 to build an Undead that hopefully has 6 drops as an option. Now, I don't think you want to save all 3. I think that's quite suicidal. I think a great rhythm is to use one of them on tier 4 and then 2 of them on tier 6. I think if you're desperate, you can probably use 2 on tier 4 to survive and then get 1 6 drop. But if you're having a good game, you probably want to use one of them on tier 4. Now, I saw several people going straight to 4 and then use it. I think that is definitely still a little dangerous, but it might become the meta strategy because you just bounce back and then you get to tier 6 faster. We'll see. I usually did it just a turn later where I leveled relatively faster to 4, but I didn't level straight to 4. So, take that as you will. Now, on tier 6, you can get Devourers of Souls, I believe it's called. I'll double check it to have the picture up. But this is essentially a minion that isn't in Battlegrounds, but you can make it as part of your Undead. And it's going to soak up death rattles you've played, kind of like the Fish of N'Zoth. Now, that means that if you have Eternal Summoners, for instance, and you just have them die off and then add the death rattle to that thing, or you've played some Anub'arax early, and the Anub'arax are just stored into that thing that's going to help you scale your attack super fast. There's definitely some silly high roll options. There's also several options to stealth. So think N'Zoth Fish with stealth and a huge army of Eternal Knights popping out later. There's some massive high roll options. But even if you didn't get those, anything that helps you reborn, anything that just adds a bunch more token stuff to the board. If you are in a meta where Undead are going to be very, very strong, the hero that does Undead things is probably going to be pretty strong. So again, that's just prediction, and at least, let's say he isn't super strong on average, there are some massive high roll options here that will, you know, almost guarantee a first place if you don't die immediately after. All right, that's it. I thought this video was very, very fun to shoot, so let me know if it was useful for you at all. Once again, it'd be pretty funny if we're actually just way off. Usually I do like to wait a little bit, play it a bit more conservative, get my reps in, get my data, and then talk to you about this. But this was a unique opportunity where I was invited to playtest the new cards in the creator event, so I thought I wouldn't let it go to waste and hopefully get you guys on a way to a great day one of the new meta. All right, have a great one, guys. See you next time.